Yeah, welcome to my video blog, Questions of Doubt in Corporate Valuation. My name is Bernhard Schwetzler, and our today's question of doubt is, how does the debt policy affect the firm's beta factor? In the last question of doubt video, I tried to show that you even need to have an assumption about the debt policy when you work with a weighted average cost of capital approach, because whenever you need to change the beta factor due to a change in the capital structure, the debt policy will affect the equation that you have to use in order to adjust the beta factor. Yeah? And so in this video, I would like to highlight how the different debt policies affect the link between the asset beta, the unlevered beta factor, and the equity beta, the levered beta factor of the firm. So we start with a very convenient feature of beta factors, the famous beta additivity. Yeah? And the idea behind this beta additivity is that if you have two stocks or two securities with known beta factors and you create a portfolio by combining the two, then the beta of the portfolio is simply the weighted average over the beta of its components. Yeah? And the reason is that all benefits from diversification, the risk reduction stemming from diversification, already has been fully exploited by all shareholders because they already hold the world market portfolio. Yeah? So, and this additivity principle nicely applies also to business lines and to the capital structure of the firm. Yeah? That is, the total asset beta as being the operating risk of the firm is simply the weighted average over the beta factor of the different business lines. Yeah? So if we have three different business lines here, A, B, and if we have a certain cash or financial position in financial assets, then the total risk of the assets, of all the assets, is the weighted average over the betas of the two business lines and the cash position. On the other hand, of course, it becomes apparent and it becomes clear that the risk that is produced by the different assets of the firm, of course, has to be borne by the investors of the firm, that is, the equity and the debt holders. Yeah? And so, of course, this additivity principle also must hold for them, that is, the beta factor of the equity holders and the beta factor of the debt holders combined, calculating the weighted average, of course, also must be equal to the risk of the total capital. And of course, here the risk of the total capital is equal to the risk of the total assets. Yeah? So in that sense, the total risk produced by the operating business of the firm somehow is to be split into the risk that is borne by the equity holder and the risk that is borne by the debt holder. Yeah? And for both sides of this balance sheet in market values and the risk properties of this balance sheet, of course, this additivity principle is going to hold. Yeah? So, and now here is again the application of this additivity principle on the right-hand side of the balance sheet, on the investors, that is the total risk of the company and of the firm, which is represented here by our unlevered or by the asset beta of the firm, is the weighted average over the beta of the equity investors and the beta of the debt investors. And the weights here, of course, reflect the target capital structure or the capital structure of the firm in market values. Yeah? So now, if we now rearrange this equation and solve it for the beta of the equity holders, then this is the result here. The levered beta, or the beta of the equity holders, is the beta of the unlevered and of the assets of the firm times 1 plus this leverage ratio minus the debt beta times here debt over equity ratio. Yeah? So now, if we assume that the debt is riskless, then by definition, of course, the beta of the debt holders is equal to 0, and then this term here is disappearing, and we get our famous here link and famous equation between the levered beta and the unlevered beta, that is the levered beta, is the unlevered beta, the asset beta, times 1 plus the leverage ratio. Yeah. And this is simply stemming from the fact that if we look back to our balance sheet here, that this part of our balance sheet and this part of the investment in the capital does not bear any risk. And that means that the leverage ratio is then, of course, amplifying the risk per unit invested in the capital of the equity holders. So if we assume, for instance, a 50-50 mix of debt and equity, then of course, as 50% of the capital is riskless, of course, the risk, the operating risk doubles for the equity holders. Yeah. So this is the idea here, the link between the asset beta and the equity beta if debt is supposed to be riskless. Yeah. So as you can see, the debt policy does not play any role in this equation here. So if we assume a world without taxes, then this is the equation that is completely independent from any debt policy. Now, what changes if we assume corporate taxes? So you see that we, which is a standard assumption in corporate valuation, we concentrate on corporate taxes. The firm gets, due to the tax deductibility of interest, gets additional tax savings every period. Yeah, and these tax savings are the level of debt at the beginning of the period times the cost of debt times the corporate tax rate. Yeah, so this is the annual tax saving that a levered firm has in addition to the cash flows of the operating business, and this is then the annual tax benefit of debt. Yeah. So the debt holders, the equity holders get more money because they receive this additional tax savings, and now the risk of this additional cash flows affects the overall risk of the equity investors and thus the firm's equity beta. Yeah? So in that sense, it's that the equity holders get more money, and the risk of this additional cash inflow, the risk of this additional tax savings, is then affecting the link between the equity beta and the asset beta of the firm. So if we talk about the risk of these tax savings, then two potential sources of risks are important. The first and more obvious one is the credit risk. So if we increase the firm's debt and the firm's leverage, then this is going to increase the probability of default or the probability of bankruptcy. And that means that debt holders will, of course, recognize this risk and they will charge a premium to compensate for it. Yeah? And that, of course, means that the debt beta factor becomes greater than 0 and RD, of course, exceeds the riskless interest rate RF. Yeah? So this is the first risk that plays a role because it will affect RD. The second component of the risk is less obvious, but also important. This is the risk of the debt level. And here our debt policy comes into play because the more often our debt level is adjusted towards the target debt level and tracing the movement of the firm value, the more volatile the future debt levels become. Yeah? And that is then, of course, the second component. The volatility of the future debt level also has an impact on the risk of the annual tax savings and, of course, on the risk of the beta factor of the equity holders. Yeah? So in general, we can say the higher the frequency of the adjustments, that is the lower K, the higher the volatility of the future debt levels becomes, and the higher the risk of our future tax savings also becomes. Yeah? So here is a general equation that is concentrating on this debt level risk. So you see that we rule out any credit risk by still assuming riskless debt, setting the debt beta equal to 0, and by doing so, of course, assuming that the cost of debt are equal to the riskless rate RF. So here you see a general equation that is going to hold for all types of different debt policies linking the asset beta, the unlevered beta, and the equity beta, the levered beta of the firm. Yeah, so this is from a paper that has been written by a professor in New Zealand, Mr. Lally, which can be downloaded at SSRN. So you see here that this is the general leverage equation, and you see here that we have this adjustment factor 1 minus tau is the corporate tax rate, and this here is the important factor that is affected by the debt policy of the firm. It's this delta K, yeah? And you see that delta K is the sum over here T equal to 1 until K of RF discounted down with the riskless rate over T period, yeah? So how can we interpret this, this factor delta K? It describes the impact of the refinancing sequence K on the risk of the tax savings. Yeah? That is, K denotes the number of years and the number of periods where the debt level stays constant, and by doing so does have a debt level risk equal to 0. Yeah? And so in that sense, if we set K very high, then the debt level stays constant over a long period. And you see then that this is increasing this adjustment factor and curbing down the impact, the risk increase impact of the leverage increase in the firm. Yeah? So, as I said, this is the general equation for the impact of the debt policy on the link between levered and unlevered beta. And so now let's look at our famous standard assumptions and policies. So let's start with our Modigliani-Miller case of a debt policy where we said that we let K go to infinity. And that means that the current level of debt stays constant until infinity, and that means it will never be adjusted. Yeah. So in that sense, you see that this term here is then converging against 1. And as you can see here, as our delta K is then converging against 1, we arrive at our famous beta equation that has been derived by Hamada, that our levered beta is the unlevered beta times 1 plus debt over equity times 1 minus the tax rate. Yeah? You see that here we get the maximum curbing effect on the increase of the beta factor, because here the level of debt is kept constant to infinity, and that means that there is actually no risk of debt level adjustments in the future. So the other polar case is the so-called Harris-Pringle debt policy, where we let K move towards 0. And again, if we let K move towards 0, then delta K also moves towards 0 and converges against 0. And then you see that this curbing effect is going to disappear. Yeah? And the reason is straightforward, because if we adjust the level of debt incrementally to every small change in the firm value, then obviously the level risk of debt is equal to the risk of the operating business of the firm. And that means then that there is no curbing effect that stems from low risk additional tax savings. Yeah? So you see then under this Harris-Pringle, if we let K go to 0, we get exactly the same equation for the link between the levered and the unlevered beta as in the case without taxes. So, and finally here, as another special case, we look at the Miles-Etzel debt policy, where we set K equal to 1. Then we have just one period of riskless tax savings, and delta K is then equal to RF discounted by RF over one period. And then you see that we have a curbing effect on the increase of the beta factor, but you see also that is rather small compared to our Modigliani-Miller debt policy. Yeah? So, as you can see here now, whenever you need to relever or delever or adjust the beta to a change in the capital structure in the future, then you need to have an assumption about the debt policy of the firm, yeah? Because the link between the levered and the unlevered beta factor depends on this assumption. So what are the implications for the delevering and relevering procedure? So for the delevering effect, we need to know the average refinancing sequence in the average debt policy in this particular industry, K industry, and we may approximate it by the average time to maturity of the debt in this industry, and then we use this K industry for the delevering of the beta, just to derive our asset beta for our particular industry. And for the relevering step, we plug in our target refinancing sequence K firm. And you see then, when knowing K firm, and as we have seen in our last QoD videos, you should know and have an idea about your appropriate K for the firm to be valued, then you have your equity beta of the firm. Yeah. So if K firm is equal to K industry, then of course you can save time because then you don't have to apply this delevering and relevering sequence. A final note: in general, you should avoid to use this popular standard equation, assuming an Modigliani-Miller debt policy that still many financial analysts seem to use, because the assumptions behind that are extremely unrealistic. Yeah? Because the first assumption is that the current level of debt will be maintained to infinity no matter where the future firm value is going to go. The second problem with this is that given the constant debt to infinity, of course, will never be able to be combined with a riskless debt. That is the assumption that the debt beta is equal to 0 also is going to collide with this standard debt policy. Yeah? So in that sense, it is a wise decision to make yourself ahead about the financing sequence and the financing debt policy of the industry and of the firm to be valued, and then use the appropriate adjustment equation. So that's it for today. Thank you.